and so they are unwilling to compromise. Then May says, in the 6 minutes of her speech, that they have so many successes, especially like Bongbong Marcos being convinced by an opposition cabinet to push for more liberalization of birth control, or even other successes by the Liberal cabinet today, such as the success in banning illegal offshore gambling, POGOs, or for example, the liberalization of tax regimes going on right now. It seems to me that if you just look at the status quo, no structural reasons, just the facts, the opposition, while being morally high ground, is extremely successful. Second rebuttal. They say their structural reason is, the reason why these people are unpopular is because ideological purity rejects reform. I would say it's the other way around. Electoral pragmatism typically targets rich donors who are most able to help you with the election. It is the poor who are least capacitated with political power. We say it's the obverse. Ideological purity most respects and upholds the rights of the poor because these are the people most marginalized and unlistened to in society, which needs purity to target them rather than rampant pragmatism. Let's now move on to the argument. Argument 1. The dangers of electoral pragmatism. The preemptive way for this argument is that even if they get everything they want, if they get a worse government in power, or they pass worse policies, because the opposition party becomes worse than the government they are replacing, this is no longer good. Remember, all would-be dictators were at one point the opposition. Duterte was at one point a firebrand supported massively by the left in order to take away corruption and take away crime. But because of the compromises made, as well as because of the compromises made with police chief and the military, he instituted extrajudicial killings and killed far worse than the alternative. Why is it that the electoral pragmatics will turn the Liberal Party worse? Think about the times when the Liberal Party did compromise in the past years, and think about their failures. Think about failures in agrarian reform like the Shenandoah massacre, the fire sale of government assets that due to their compromise caused them to lose billions of dollars because they sold for dirt cheap to private corporations that they made concessions to in order to win elections. Think about development policy that allowed the Villiars, we have promised you say that she did it, that allowed the Villiars to do land grabbing and make millions of pesos because they made compromises in order to get elected. Think about the extreme corruption that we saw that characterized the regimes of Pinoy and previous Liberal Party candidates. Why is it the case structurally, other than this fact, this truth you can give? 5 reasons. Number 1 is that these Liberal candidates that potentially win or get into power implement bad policies. Sit down. They're forced to compromise on these bad policies, especially since they're not the ones in the driving seat, in order to get into power in the first place. Secondly is that they reinforce that obeisance to the government is the only way to get into power, which means they weaken other sources of ideas, other sources of hearing from poor people, because these are just not ways to win. And so you further weaken the ability to listen to the most vulnerable. Thirdly, is that the type of people you attract to your party are not those that care about poor people or care about minorities. These are the people, as you've established, power seekers. These are the ones that you attract and turn into politicians, not the ones that you can trust to run the government. Fourthly is that they become co-opted by radicals. They become co-opted by awful right-wingers that take advantage of your ability and willingness to compromise with them. The very moment you compromise with Bongbong Marcos and you see all ability to have democracy and checks and balances and free will and free speech in place is the moment that you can turn the trigger and say, okay, democracy is over, you've already conceded to us. So these points show that in fact the dangers of electoral pragmatism are extreme, in the sense that they risk having an outcome worse than just losing the election, which is losing potentially, 1, the ability for us to hold and check and balance our democracy, 2, not implement bad policies or even be more corrupt, sit down, and 3, we're skeptical that the policy that even passed will be good for people. Secondly, why is moral principle good and instrumental in winning? There are 4 reasons why you will be more likely to win if you are extremely principled and ideologically consistent. First, the current trend is that people are tired of pragmatic, cancer politicians. More political dynasties in the last election than ever, like in BRAMM or in Mandaluyong, have been taken away. Moral ideological purity is currently extremely appealing to voters, whereas the label of balimbing, the label of person who shifts from party to party and doesn't have any ideological appearances, is a poison to a candidate's future. Which is why just being power-seeking and just pretending to be ideologically pure is not enough. You actually need to be pure. Sit down. Secondly, that voters are unresponsive and apathetic and unresponsive to pragmatism. Think about how unexcited they were when Lenny said she would compromise on divorce, compromise on gay marriage, and then she lost by a landslide because left-wing voters were extremely unappealed by this. They moved to other alternatives. The left wing was split because they were unsecure. Thirdly, ethical consistency and purity makes it extremely hard to muscle against you, meaning that it's much easier for you to defend yourself against conservatives and right-wingers. Fourthly, electoral pragmatism creates a divided political base where people are unhappy with the compromises you make, so you just don't get enough votes to be powerful in the first place, even if you do secure political alliances. And fifthly is that, guys, Rhea just concedes that they will do illegal things, but the difference is they're not the government. If you do fake news, if you do libel, you will get targeted and prosecuted by the government the moment happen to many people, like Diliman, for example. So practically what happens is when you concede to these crimes and you concede to use their tactics, but you don't have their power or their aims, what happens is that you lose more power than you gain. What are the consequences of this? First, the constructive is that we get more policies into power. We're able to do good things like all the policy reform that they want, as well as in addition, agrarian reform, reproductive healthcare, all the policies the government has to give up on in order for them to succeed. I guess I'll take a POI because he doesn't have one.
Yeah, you're arguing that pro-establishment politicians are too extreme right now, but in fact, they are using populist rhetoric in order to still become popular. That's why people on the ground are still voting for jailed individuals like Roderick Paulatians.
I just put in a percent POI.
Populist rhetorics are good, but the thing is, if we don't use them, Duterte will use them. If we don't use them, Marcos will use them. But the thing is, they're in government now, right? So I don't know why I hope we get that out. So the three things that, in addition to this, are number one is that if you don't have the national election, at least you can win local elections, especially with the Mandanas ruling and the reallocation of funding to local and municipal governments. You're able to actually utilize the people, especially with welfare being allocated to people proximate to you, rather than just having a distant national government that you may or may not win. We're able to at least guarantee ideological purity on people on the ground. But thirdly is that there's a discursive effect, which is that the influence of the debate on the youth on national television, the debate of being able to force candidates to talk about these issues, like Andrew Yan, for example, being able to get UBI into, for example, into government because he's able to debate events against Biden and Biden was forced to implement in his government. So even if you don't win, you're able to get many of these good things into power. But the thing is, the moment you start compromising, like let's say BBM, or let's say Duterte, or let's say Pinoy, and all of the other awful candidates that we've had in the past, you start sliding into evil. You start sliding into power seeking. This is how democracy dies, not with a bang, but with a whip.
네, 이거 법 마진 여기서
David's speech only works if you believe logical reasons not within the Philippines. Clearly, it's the case patronage networks are integrated and are seen as symbolically tied towards the Philippines. Their side completely goes against that. Their side just says ideological purity wins the masses. Guess who won the recent election in a landslide? It's Bongbong Marcos and Duterte, clearly appealing to pragmatism. So clearly, it's the case. If they think they have the facts, they don't. They have to prove that from Alex very overwhelmingly. Firstly, then, some responses to what David said. Firstly, they say they're successful right now because they can pass some forms of liberalized reforms, etc. Number one, these things are usually majority of the incumbent that so passed it. It's clearly unclear what the opposition has done here. Secondly, people still disrespect Risa Hontiveros and she's not seen as an important part of the party. Clearly, a lot of the party also shuns her and thinks that she's a sellout. So clearly, even if she is the most successful, they shun her as a sellout. So it's not likely that she's promoted on their side of the house. Secondly, they say ideological purity accepts the poor. One, it's not about whether it does or not. It's about what the poor think are accepting of them. And clearly, look at Pinat in the past, for example. Look at the many failures that Lenny had towards the poor, the promises that they had towards the poor, and Lenny failed majorly in the election. So they feel as if they cannot get any tangible change inside their ideology. It doesn't feed their children, it doesn't send them to school on their side of the house. They say, additionally from their argument, they say it's bad to have the people on the other side of the house who are ideologically compromising, because one, they pass bad policy, two, they reinforce the status quo. I want to question this argument in two ways. One, why is it bad policy? At minimum, the incumbent would pass a version of the policy, at least under our side of the house, when they have a more progressively aligned, even if it's not fully progressive, they have to make concessions to reach the media. And at that point, when there's more of those people at the discussion table, now at minimum, we have more of these policies that approximate a version of more progressive or liberalized kinds of reforms. If these people don't exist on their side of the house, they would pass those policies anyways, but their side of the house has none of these voices to speak out for the poor. None of these voices that say we ought to liberalize in some way. Secondly, they say reinforce the status quo. Guess what, guys? The status quo will happen regardless. Regional power brokers are the reason why national elections happen, and you cannot ever disentrench these traditional elites. Their side gives no solution towards engaging with places like Ilocos and Mindanao that are so incredibly important powers and places of national politics on their side of the house. They do not engage with the status quo. They just say you shouldn't reinforce it, but it will exist on either side and they give you no solution. Thirdly, they say you attract bad people. No, it's not proven, firstly. But secondly, most people in Philippine politics are themselves, even if they're politicians, jaded with the status quo. Sure, many of them want liberalization, want good things, progressive reform. It's not bad for you to still work within the system. You have to prove why it's bad for you to work within the system and compromise, and because magically you become a bad person. This argument is absurd. It only works if you look at structural reasons. They then give you a second argument as to why moral principles will work. They say the poor support it. Number one, the poor does not support ideological purity because one, guess what? It has a lot of institutional baggage over the many decades it's been failing in the past. Their side has a shackle of the past on their side. In things like Vidal, in things like Lenny, failing in the past multiple times consecutively and entrenching the particular elites that are now so powerful they cannot be disentrenched under our side. Secondly, they say they need to align to the most ideologically pure. Guess what the most ideologically pure people are? The people easiest to brand as communists, easiest to brand as dissidents against the state, and precisely for the argument that Bea explains, are the easiest for the incumbent to brand as the people to suppress in things like protests, suppress in things like rallies, to not ally with, to blacklist online, to use all of the machinery that we've already entrenched against them. That's why their argument only exists in debate land. It has no solvency in the Philippines. What is our argument then? Firstly, we explained that moral high ground for the reasons and response I gave you doesn't work. I will add an extension. Why is it likely that the electoral pragmatism will work? Why will electoral pragmatism work? Note a couple of reasons here. What will we do under our side of the house? It looks like, one, as what Bea explained, this is the best time to ally with the current incumbent because it's now most ideologically similar or more willing to concede at the point in time which Marcos wants to differentiate himself from Duterte in the past. He's more likely to ally with us. Secondly, it looks like allying and working with patronage networks in regional power alliances and regional power brokers in local elites, where previously they didn't want to do so, now we go into places like Ilocos and Mindanao and we work within the system. If they say we work in fake news, we work in vote buying, I don't give a shit. That was gets politics and people in power to support things that we actually care about. Thirdly, it was like taking moderate policies. Even if we're just part of the department, we're more willing to be voices in that department versus their side, has none of these people on their side. Let's take the hard line on our side. Why is this good even if we don't have full systemic change? 3 reasons. Firstly, institutional presence at minimum versus the very, very small on their side leads to incremental reform. If you have more of these people and more of the incumbent giving concessions to the opposition to put them in the Department of Education, put them in the Department of Agriculture, maybe they can make massive sweeping change. At minimum, they can have liberalized reform for agrarian reform. Things like, for example, more education in schools in regional areas where previously there's no incentive to appeal to them. Secondly, it's symbolic wins. When there's more symbolic wins under our side, even if it's the diluted form, in the long term, it's now reverses the perception of the opposition as losers, as constantly people that will never win elections, as losing ground. When we have any of these things under our side, it's better than none of theirs on their side that constantly reverses the appeal of the opposition. No.
I think it's a bit misleading to say that these are symbolic wins because you're entirely giving yourself up to the government. None of these are your wins. You're not even a party anymore, you're just part of the government.
You are still the opposition party. You can still label yourself as the opposition. You also are more liberal in nature than the incumbent. The incumbent is more likely to ally with you though, because they still want to consolidate power. So that's absurd again, David. Secondly, at minimum we have more symbolic wins, which means that even if we want to be more ideologically aligned in the future, we have a prerequisite under our side versus their side that kills any sort of momentum at the point and also reverses the momentum of the opposition party. But thirdly, it's institutional resistance. No, the worst thing that could happen is incumbents having no resistance in the internal boards, in the discussion tables. At minimum, under our side of the house, we can repeal things that insanely, terribly, like very stacked anti-terror bills that would happen in the future when Marcos completely consolidates his power. Because obviously, the opposition has an incentive to go against these kinds of things on either side. If they have none of these voices on the table that can repeal them, or none of these voices that have to be conceded to by the incumbent to gain more power, to pass this as a majority, their side has all of these things that can weaponize against the poor, weaponize against opposition, and legitimate progressives on our side. Their side of the house kills them at any momentum they have. For those reasons then, oppose.
And then if you have this side, I think that we don't opt for the way.
reproductive health and handouts of like condoms and birth control, because that is the status quo. It is not supporting bills that makes tax filing for small businesses possible, because that's currently the stances of politicians like Risa Contiveros and Walden Bello. Like, they're not criticizing that, guys. They're actually in support of that. What compromises and broad alliances they have to make, and in order for this debate to work, is what currently they're not making compromises and broad alliances for. Things such as allowing further land grabbing and expansion of the billiards. Things like allowing more human rights violations to occur, and not calling out corruption and the gross misuse of funds that happens in the Department of Health, in the Department of Education, and letting these issues slide. That is the trade-off that opening government has to make in order for a lot of their benefits, such as you being allowed into the inner circles of the Marcos and the Duterte regime, you being allowed to hold large positions of power, because you can't claim large impacts without making large sacrifices. And therefore, the question of opening opposition is simple: is the large sacrifices actually worth the trade-off of the Philippine opposition, of defending the most marginalized in this debate? The second thing I want to say is, what benefits can opening government claim? They can't say that you will that you will be able to claim Ilocos and Davao, because hello, these are the strongholds of the Marcos and the Dutertes. This debate has to occur in places like Central Mindanao, in Central Visayas and Luzon, where there are no strongholds of different politicians, and therefore a lot of the reasons and empirical evidence coming from David does work. The second thing is, if you're going to say that politicians in Philippine legislature now want to claim dominion, then I'm not sure why maintaining ideological purity doesn't work. Because like I said, it's the fact that the establishment still has to appeal to the Philippine opposition to get those votes, to get some bills passed. That's why it's a perfect time for you not to give in to their demands. It is a time for you to stay steady, hold fast, because the status quo is working, even if it's not the most perfect right now, right? The third question that I want to ask is, will political pragmatism work? And note that for you to give open government to win, there are two assumptions that you have to believe. The first is that you will be given these positions just because you appeal to the establishment and to Duterte and Marcos. And the second is you will be given a large position that is of the decision-making table. There are four things that I want to particularly explain here. The first is, they don't have the funding, guys. Look at the mechanisms in which you have to get a lot of the votes and a lot of the appeals of side-opening government. You have to engage in bribes. You have to fund massive control farms. And that means that you actually don't have the resources to do so, because the Marcoses and the Dutertes have the backings of not just the Philippine treasury through vis-a-vis corruption, but of large corporations and the large Philippine elite. Secondly, even if you do have more funding and more political support, that is not meaningful. It's the fact that your campaign funding is controlled by the big by large corporations that control and have a say to how you use this campaign funding and votes, because that's why you got to the position to begin with. It means that you can't block those legislative bills. You can't use that funding into calling out or allocating it to more whistleblowers and the like, because it did not come from you. It came from them. But thirdly, you're just not trustworthy, right? Because you were strongly distrusted before, because you were very vocally opposition to this. This is not a recreates world. You have to exist in the status quo where Walden Bello, and Risa Contiveros have acquired the reputation of being vastly oppositional to this. If you suddenly be like, yeah, let's be buddies, they're not going to just accept you. They're going to be massively distrustful of you. And that's why the regional backing and brokers don't work on opening government, because the regional brokers know that they have a terrible history of being oppositional to them. What they're gonna do is, when you concede or you don't vocally oppose them, is to just forward the people that they already like and people that they trust more, so you don't actually get more seats in the table. You just make it easier for their own favorites and for more pro-Marcos and pro-Dutertes to get into these seats of power instead. But lastly, you lose the ability to criticize problematic bills, right? This is where I want to make the flip. The fact that your name is now on the bill, if Risa Contiveros is there, it's the fact that she can't criticize this anymore, because she's literally, her credibility is also on the line. And I have to note, if you're going to say that the problem right now is people like Risa Contiveros and the like being disrespected, even when they're pure, imagine if they flip. Now they're both going to be called called a hypocrite and a sellout, and that means more battles of opening government. Before that, Jello.
Even if you believe that you still have to believe that any win in opposition, like cracking down on August, like taking Alice Go, is often hijacked by the incumbent to prop up their own allies. So maybe Purity is popular with the left-wing liberals on Twitter, but it's not popular with the average voter.
Duterte, like the fact that Marcos banned pogos, the fact that they were willing to jail these people, suggests that it's popular. And even if it isn't popular, the fact that it is happening and it still helps marginalized individuals. But the last thing is, I want to get the massive trade-off or like the massive engagement. What if we don't get what if ideological purity doesn't work and we don't get political power? Why is this okay? Note that the power of the Philippine opposition isn't just in political seats, it's massively social. It's things like Amat Buhay, it things like a lot of charities and volunteer reports that, for example, fund homeless shelters for IPs, that fund their productive healthcare access for women who are left out by the system. The reason as to why so many people in the left or so many liberals are willing to fund these things is because they trust that the people who run this, people like Lenny Robredo, people like Risa Ontiveros, are one, honest people that will use funds to actually helping those poor and not to electioneering, not to funding their own selfish interests. But number two, it's the fact that we can rely on these politicians to not switch their stances left and right wherever it's more convenient for them. And it's important because even when we don't have access to political power, their social influence is still massive. And that's why, if you believe, and it is likely the case on both sides, it's not likely that they'll win seats in the election on president. It's not likely they'll get in the highest positions of cabinet where they'll get meaningful change. It is change on the ground and the grassroots, and that is relying on you maintaining credibility. And that is why moral high ground is important, not pragmatism where you believe to be malignant, where you believe to be dishonest, where you believe to be self-interested, and not one that is for the people, by the people. Democracy is one that survives in opposition, and that's why the Philippine opposition has to try, not just in name, but on practice, side with all. Thanks.
The dialogue, inviting a lot of government.
The moment the Philippine opposition will push themselves into the extreme narrative that is being imposed by the right, that is too liberal, too idealistic, and too radical, is the moment that the Philippine opposition is going to lose its voter base, but much more its ability to actually make change. A few points of context that I want to clarify in this debate, right? What exactly does this Philippine opposition look like? Because this exists on a spectrum. You have the radical leftists and the socialists, you have the ones that carry out the Macbayan bloc, but at the same time, you similarly have the moderates or the more center leftists. They have more
these generations are called too liberal, so they won't win. Your first premise is that the younger generation is popular because they're able to move, be more progressive. So like, which premise is correct?
Okay, I'm gonna expound on that American. But two responses that I want to make to OO, right? First of all, they're telling us that inherently all of these people are going to be tired of electoral pragmatism and that this is enough reason for the Philippine opposition not to comply. Panel, I want you to vibe check this, right? Number one, can people on the ground even tell that they're power hungry? And number two, do they even actually care that these politicians are power hungry? In status quo, people are inherently going to be leaning more towards their ideology because of this compliance with their beliefs and their inherent structures. So even if you're going to have these people who are tired of electoral pragmatism, you're still going to be able to garner the same power and that electoral leverage is unique to government side. But secondly, they're arguing hard line in terms of the extremists, right? They're telling us that we're going to become more corrupt, comply in bribes, and become untrustworthy. This is very unlikely due to existence of the political spectrum. You quite literally still have the center left. But in terms of the actual timeline, you have to acknowledge that your ideological, non-ideological purity does not mean an abandonment of your ideology. Just because you're going to have these alliances doesn't mean you're going to abandon any of your poor sentiment inherently. So by doing so, by complying with this popular rhetoric, you're actually going to be able to co-opt the benefits of love and actually be able to outline how exactly you're going to get the impacts for OG, right? But on to my extension then, why is pursuing the moral high ground in politics inherently immoral for all of the Philippine opposition? Why, firstly, is the Philippine opposition only going to be able to forward change when this is adopted? This is because look at the current electoral landscape, right? Let's look at the hope of our Philippine status quo in the government. You have Rizal Rivera who's able to actively counter the Duterte administration. She's able to bring forward all of these policies in a way that is number one, more widespread, and number two, inherently legitimate. But beyond all of these networks and resources that you try to claim on opening government, you're actually going to be able to gain more of a public sentiment and actual critical mass. You have more people that are going to support you if you're going to side with politicians like Isko Moreno, for example. But on the comparative, you're limited to inherently just grassroots movements, which are going to take even more time and decrease the impact and extent that you have in your ability to make change. Because acknowledge here that social change happens not out of your actual on-the-ground support, but in terms of the policies that these politicians are pushing. Why then is it the opportune time for Philippine opposition to adopt this? Because of the fragmentation of the right. Previously, there was a strong right narrative that made it impossible for left-wing populism to actually arise, right? This is because left-wing populism is in alignment with the ideology of antagonism. When you actually have all of these things that are open to negotiations, which is only going to happen when you have alliances with the center, this is the only time then that you're actually going to be able to consolidate power. Just because you're going to align with the center doesn't mean you're going to compromise your values. Negotiations can still happen within the party. So for all of these reasons, if you want to forward at least welfare for the people, right?
Then the well government, the well
Curfew-wise, just stand up. Speech starts with a The Philippine opposition, maintaining their unalienable values and policies, is what forces traditional political landscapes to actually hedge against its policies. This is the only way for you to get good structural policies to pass when the rest of the Philippines sees us as sore losers. Two extensions then. The first is how this shifts progressive policy, even if it's not done by politicians on the opposition party. 4 points of structural reasons. One, the Philippine opposition is a very, very unique position because we're seen as one, sore losers because of two structural reasons.
One, it was misinformation campaigns run by traditional politicians. But secondly, it looks like out-of-touch campaigns, i.e. people in decisive and now feel underrepresented and feel disenfranchised by the imperial Manila elite. Secondly, is that there was generally a lack of strategy after President Aquino 2016. But thirdly, structurally, inherently, the opposition parties have unalienable policies and rights that they want to defend. It looks like you having policies that are contingent on protecting human rights, or contingent on protecting democracy or anti-corruption. What this means is that the political left or progressive parties have less political maneuverability. The conclusion of these four structural reasons is twofold. One, that all these reasons prove that regardless of political pragmatics, you will not be successful. And in the trade-off that government tries to take between ideology and pragmatics, we suggest that this trade-off will actually get nothing on government. Because one, it is unlikely for them to win, because either you will lose your support base on government, or you're going to have to force yourself to try to implement other policies that go against your unalienable policies or rights that you fight for. But secondly, what happens then on our side is that the types of policies that are ran by traditional politicians on a national level changes on our side. On a national level, traditional politicians are forced to make policies that are genuinely good for people. And this is a very simple intuition prompt here. So that if opposition parties say that we're pro-healthcare, the traditional politicians all say that they're pro-healthcare in order to co-opt the vote that exists in opposition blocks, but also to drown other opposition voices. This exclusively happens when you don't concede to your political ideologies. Because at the point at which you do, you lose your ability to use political capture votes to hedge against traditional politicians to go off your policies. Maybe it's not a one-to-one match of policy, but it is far more likely, insofar as the core structure that we prove, that the opposition parties are just generally very weak or just seen as weak by the vast majority of people. The way of this extension is threefold. One, that the trade-off is useless on government because you mathematically don't have a large say within these circles. But secondly, you're forced to concede to certain policies and explain why that's just more harmful. Insofar that you lose the ability for traditional politicians to go up your policies because you concede, when you walk into the door. But secondly, to explain that the political landscape actually changes when opposition parties stick to their guns, and that's when you get traditional policies, traditional politicians to pass the policies that you want. The best case is that you go up good general policies that opposition parties fight for. The medium case is that it's diluted, but the worst case here is that you avoid, on our side, that you avoid less terror policies and terror bills when you have to hedge against the values of the Philippine opposition. Secondly, we protect the vast majority of our constituents insofar that we are able to at the very least get some diluted forms of policies insofar that traditional politicians are forced to hedge against our values. But thirdly, I think just simply that OJ assumes a clear left-right split, but the political landscape in the Philippines isn't like that because it's generally just opposition parties and everyone else. What we explain here is that it is the fact that when you stick to your guns, you just generally get far more traditional politicians to hedge against your policies. The second extension then is that why does opposition parties defend their policy changes on politics on a local level. The context is that the Philippines has very, very muddy party lines on political affiliations. One, there's generally no regulations or just generally no stigma against territorialism. But secondly, there's a lot of campaigns are just generally self-funded as opposed to controlled party funding. What happens then is that we agree that the vast majority of opposition candidates will lose at either side of the house. But the difference is that in order for the vast majority of traditional candidates to win, they have to co-opt as many opposition policies as possible to win. And the structured reason is that one is what we have as pure party affiliations. Two, it's things like electoral incentive. But three, even if you are likely to win regardless on either side, it's the fact that traditional policies want to win by a landslide and want to create far more cushion for the next elections. The conclusion of this is that one, more progressive policies are implemented even if it's not done by opposition parties. But secondly, independent of the kind of opposition, it's good on a local level. Because we'd like to note here that on a local level, on many years of congressmen run on the post, having having a progressive candidate or someone from the opposition run against these candidates at a local level is good. Because one, it just creates former competition for these local politicians to hedge against those values. But secondly, you're able to force these politicians do not get away with as much their policies at the end of the day. Even if they don't win at a national level, it's the fact that there are actual people who run against these politicians as opposed to government when they run on the post. This is very good for opening opposition because they try to prove why they're likely to win. We prove that regardless of winning, it's for good, OG.
So what is the comparative? Because on your end, you still only have recent Monteveros for tracking all of the examples that we're willing to give to prove that the opposition is okay. The most of the money is with the incumbent. So again, how do you win elections? Because most of your mechanism assumes that you're on equal playing field with the incumbent.
No. We explain the burdens of winning elections. We explain that this strategy you're able to force traditional policies on traditional politicians to co-opt as much of the opposition vote on our side, and that's what actually leads to you getting policies. To make up the second extension is simple. One, this is the clearest impact on the round. It's hard to win national elections on either side, and thus but on comparative, local elections are just far more easier when you can just run against the deficit much easier. But secondly, it is the clearest impact on the round because it's the most proximate impact on the round to the individuals and opposition parties want to protect. If it means that streets are safer, if it means that agricultural subsidies are just easier because easier to acquire because it's not corrupted, this is a massive win. This is inherently the way to winning because regardless if you win in local elections, we claim that just because someone actually runs against these mayors who are usually unopposed, that's the point at which we force people in local elections to hedge against opposition policies, and that's how we force traditional politicians to go off as much of a progressive policy or generally good policies that opposition parties want to get in the status quo. For those reasons, CO. Thanks.
I think the law of
The Philippine opposition is the last line of defense of people on the ground against structural injustice. And insofar as, on your side of the house, the Philippine opposition will always fail and not get any change done, or any kind of symbolic wins, as opening God trying to prove but failed to do so. And as long as we're going to be red as communists, regardless of how moderate or how center-left is to deceive you, want to appear on media, for example, because of misinformation tactics that will always exist in opposition, I think this will always lead to violence. The first thing I'll do is clarify what the hell is going on in the Philippines because I think OO is quite confused. There are two splits that exist. The first is on the Philippine opposition and the second exists within the establishment, right? So the Philippine opposition is split. There are radicals, like those who align with the National Democrat sentiment of Joma Sison, pushing for revolution, for example, and for more radical reforms. But there are also moderate individuals, the social democrats like Risa Hontiveros and the Akbayan Party, for example. The problem is, regardless if you are moderate, regardless if you are centrist, you will always be seen as radical if you align with liberalism because of the anti-terror law and also because of red tagging, which is a culture ingrained by the administration of Duterte as well as Marcos. So the idea of being a sore loser will only be exacerbated exclusively imposing opposition precisely because of this cultural effect and the discursive effect, for example, that people are spying and people are trying to plot a revolution against the government which will lead to bloodshed. That's why the opposition is inherently unpopular. But the second split is between the establishment, right? And this is because of power hunger between these kinds of conservatives. Because of the multi-party system of the Philippines, there are a lot of fragmentations in terms of ideology. Like even Marcos or even Duterte are fighting right now. This was contextualized by Prime Minister in this particular debate. But the extent by which this is the opportune time in terms of reconsolidating the center-right with the center-left is precisely the argumentation that will win us the round. The last thing I want to contextualize is the decision calculus of voters on the ground. We argued this from the POI, which I think David said that he didn't understand. So I'll explain it, right? So, voters in the Philippines do not rely purely on ideology. To some extent, those who are educated about Marxism, those who are educated about progressive ideals might be in line with those ideology. But they often rely on things like are tangibly visible with media, with large corporations saying that these activities are the result of these politicians. So regardless of any kind of activism that exists in opening opposition, as long as there is that discursive effect that people see on TV, that it's the Villar's who built these houses, for example, this will always and automatically be attributed to the establishment and never to the Philippine opposition, which means Alex is wrong. We're not going to rely purely on bribes and disinformation. In some cases, it's okay, but I think the more strategic way for the opposition to do is to rely on populist media and rhetoric that will allow them that discursive effect in national television to discuss UBI, for example, which will only exist if the establishment allows you the chance to go up to the stage. So in conclusion, the Philippine media is pro-establishment already because the contributions to uplift them from poverty are a direct result of the policies that these pro-establishment politicians inculcate in society. It is a lie that there will be distrust under ours in the House. Because, guys, if you are supporting the politicians who brought you food on the table, who brought you cash grants, then why will people distrust you? It simply does not make sense. So, this is also conceded, by the way, by a member of opposition saying that there's no stigma against third votism in Philippine politics. Like, a member said the title, right? This was also exclusively argued by the member when she contextualized correctly that it's the multi-party system nature of Philippine politics that allows flexibility in terms of ideology, which will lead to the downfall of purity. David.
So this is why I think KY, right? This is entirely on controversial ground. Of course, we will have advertisements. This is less grave ground than the opening government statute, plus at least politically see like fake news and bribery.
Yeah, you will have like liberal advertisements, but people on the ground won't believe you as a liberal because they will always tie you back to radicalism, to times of the revolution, because it will always be the narrative that you're a red person. You cannot be my president because you're gonna cause the bloodshed of people who will supported by upliftment from poverty. The next thing I'll do then, because the context is quite clearly in favor of closing government, is to talk about this idea about ideological purity. Because the claim from opposition is to say that it actually favors the poor. I think this is false on two grounds. The first is because automatically on the ground, people view these kinds of politicians as those who talk over them and are unrepresenting the kinds of plights and ideals that they're actually doing. So for example, a lot of the ties to the radical left, for instance, is that they cause revolutionary taxes, for instance, and they cause bloodshed. That's why it's so unpalatable for them. And this is because of the culture of red tagging with the middle class and a lot of poor, righteous individuals do not want to support the Philippine opposition because they're always associated with radicalism. So on our side, you reverse this and you de-radicalize liberalism precisely because you galvanize and weaponize populist rhetoric to ensure that you have the license to say that no, we are also reasonable. We don't want to cause bloodshed in the first place. We just want the best for the Philippines at the end of the day. And also this is because of dissatisfaction with their current lived conditions. That's why they also agree with BBM. And it's also because a lot of the concepts of this are too complex, like Marxism. But also it's because, thirdly, of the failures of their historically never winning seats, for example, or even the effects of activism being tied back to the establishment. So it's wrong that Lenny, like people were unexcited with Lenny because she started being compromised, like in terms of like these kinds of liberal policies. People were unexcited with Lenny because they associated Lenny with liberalism and hence radical change and action that people on the ground will never stand with. So, what you do on side opposition is you push people to more pro-establishment politicians instead of them galvanizing themselves to vote for more median or liberal policies, and you never capture that inside opposition. The next thing they argue is in terms of pro-establishment hijack. I think this is untrue. We've proven that because of the right split right now, the new generations from past pro-establishment politicians are also dissatisfied with the corruption and the confusion caused by BBM and Duterte. And that's why they have the power vacuum. They want to seek more control in order to restore some control and some unity in terms of the establishment, which lowers their capacity to hijack you. But also it increases your leverage to be more accountable. Because what happens in closing government is, now that you're negotiating, when you do the misinformation campaigns, because you're also involving some righteous politicians in you have the leverage to also involve them in that kind of dealings. On their side, these righteous will only say and will always launch misinformation campaigns and will always have the incentive to persecute you. So on our side, you reverse that. As long as you de-radicalize liberalism, I think that is the way to ensure that some victories are won with the Philippine opposition.
Like, debate on open
Is this voice modulation?
Even before this motion existed, we have had incumbent politicians pass opposition policies because they knew that the opposition was a threat. Duterte literally passed the Freedom of Information Bill and made state universities free, which the closing half or largely benefits from in their personal lives. Marcos implemented AHAP, which is literally a form of UBI, which is something that is extremely radical, yet was able to pass it because he was able to frame it as an incumbent thing and not lumped in with the dirty liberals that average Filipinos don't like. The only reason why this happens is because the opposition continues to be an enemy, continues to compete with the incumbent, and continues to be a threat, which is what it needs to be continued to be in the future. There are two things that I want to clarify at the top of the speech before the defense of the extension. The first is that Philippine politics cannot be synthesized in a left or right, like in the same way that opening house did, because it's incredibly weird. A lot of politicians don't have ideological loyalty for the reasons that Kyle and I pointed out. The fact that there is a rampant amount of turncoatism, the fact that there is a lot of self-interest and self-funding, which means that they are not dependent on party line, similar to the US, for example, where most politicians get their funding from Democrats or Republicans, or the fact that they have very little loyalty to the party on a national level, right? What this means is that a lot of them continuously shift policies and continue to co-opt policies from each other. Because if you are an incumbent and you try to beat out the opposition person with significantly less resources, all you have to do is spin out their advantage. So if the opposition politician says, I want to fight for healthcare, all you have to do is say that you don't want to do the same thing. And since you already have the advantage, you keep it inherently. This was the inherent contribution that we made coming from CO, which demonstrates why these policies are passed independent of the opening debate on the question of who wins, who loses, what policies are you able to forward. But the second thing that I want to clarify is that a lot of local elections have legal participation, and this is an important impact that everybody misses, right? Like, let's step outside the national level of politics and go to like actual communities like in the Visayas and Mindanao region. A lot of these seats are uncontested, and that is a massive problem because that means that like elite politicians can continuously run unopposed, continuously implement their policies with no one checking them. This is why Kyle's extension is incredibly important, because whatever happens on the national level, which is like a massive deadlock at the moment, what we ensure is that in the local level, politicians are kept in check. Cities are run at least decently, if not properly, and at the very least we prevent tyranny on the local level, which is what the clear statement of this debate is. No, that in of itself means that CO is here to proceed. The next thing I'll do is defend the extension, which will be a relatively easy task because we don't get much response coming from the previous speech. The first is that I want to note that our case is independent of electoral success, which is what the contingency is for the other Philippines in this house. They say that, oh, you have like, you can focus on social things because all concede that the opposition is also a social force. The difference that we're able to prove is that what we demonstrate is independent of electoral success. We still get some amount of political success, even if it isn't carried out by the Philippine opposition. So for example, like what I mentioned, you have AHAP by BBM, which is a form of like UBI, or the fact that you have like softened policies and band-aid solutions. Why is this okay? Because, no, the other, like, governments themselves concedes that this happens in the status quo. When OG talks about BBM trying to co-opt things like birth control, even before the opposition tried to align with them in the first place, this demonstrates that this proves the assertion from OO that this already happens in the status quo. We give the mechanism as to why that is the case. They say that, and this is important, because the extent of OO's claim is to say that the Liberal Party will get worse and they will do like very worst case things. Like, I'm not sure that even if, like, let's be charitable, even in the instance where the Liberal Party aligns, for example, with the Villiers, I'm not sure they're just gonna let them run around willy-nilly and like build subdivisions everywhere. So our claim is more realistic. Maybe it is true that like our claim is more realistic. Even in those instances, we're like, able to trade that off and demonstrate that we do get some amount of policies passed. But the second and more important thing that we demonstrated was to get alternatives on the local level. And I want to weigh this, right? That it is very difficult to win on the national level, right? Especially when the margin, like when both sides of the house are trying to co-opt each other and thin out the margin in this debate. So it is unclear as to what changes in terms of resources, in terms of politics. What is important is that we're able to check local dynasties.
This looks like the Romualdez and Camiguin, or the Bukidnon Paglaong party winning 95% of the seats in the region. Just to have one opposition party run against them is a massive burden for these people, even if they don't win. Because what that means is that the incumbents will have to exert more effort in terms of trying to pass policies, in terms of trying to improve their lives. So at the very least, right, even if these opposition parties don't win, they are